If you're new to this channel, you may be thinking, okay, she says she's a noob, but how noob is she? Well, better than whatever the fuck Elon Musk is doing, but still a noob. To give a bit of context, I didn't really get into any serious video gaming until I was a senior in high school, a bit over a decade ago. I didn't grow up with video games, so those fast reflexes didn't really get a chance to develop. And you can click on any one of my earlier Doom reviews to see that I made judicious use of cheats. So you can bet your sweet ass that I didn't really fall in love with ARPGs. Too much thinking, the isometric view sometimes is hard to work with, and big boss fights, not for me. This isn't to say that I have never played RPGs at all. In fact, I have nearly 1,000 lifetime hours in Skyrim, but ARPGs are a particular brand of difficult. Well, until the big Path of Exile 2 presentation that came about a week before it came out. For a bit of additional context, my partner's a giant Path of Exile nerd, and as it turns out, we live fairly close to the Grinding Gear Games offices in Auckland. Like, they're right near the grocery store we always go to. But in any case, my partner was watching the presentation, and I was doing something on my computer, but I could overhear Jonathan's sweet voice talking about terms that felt vaguely familiar. My Skyrim experience was calling to me. So I sat and I watched, and I immediately was taken in by the great explanations of all the mechanics and concepts that made Path of Exile 2. It's an excellent lesson in marketing, in my opinion. When you have mechanically complex games, explain them, arm the players with knowledge, and they will feel more inclined to buy the game. It helps to have a great speaking voice, too. Okay, before I talk about my experience and opinions about the game itself, I'm going to issue a quick disclaimer. These are my opinions and experiences alone. I'm going to try to avoid giving specific advice about builds, as I'm aware that my builds have certain flaws. I didn't use any expert guides, as I wanted to experience character building for myself. I did have some help. My partner is at the desk across from me, so often I'd just ask him a question here or there. And I did have to have a bit of help in the gameplay and gear as well in certain places. I'm not a solo self-found player, but I don't currently participate in trading in the traditional sense. There's a guild stash, but I try not to grab from it unless I'm desperate. I will show my passive trees in case you're curious, but I'm not currently taking advice on the builds, mostly because the game is in early access and therefore things can change at any time, so some advice may be out of date by the time I or others refer back to it. I will link some resources if you are looking for expert guidance. So, first things first. If you've never looked at the Path of Exile passive tree before, it can be quite a challenge to make sense of, but I'm going to push back on the idea that it's impossible to understand as a new player. If you've played any RPG, doesn't matter which, Skyrim, Cyberpunk, Witcher, whatever, all of those have skill trees, and you use only parts of those skill trees along with your gear in order to achieve a certain result with your build. The biggest difference is that in most RPGs, the full skill tree is split, whereas with PoE, it's in one big tree. This does change how the tree functions. You do have to plan ahead a bit in order to path to the right node, but I'd argue that some degree of planning is needed for any RPG build. If you've built good habits with any regular RPG, I think you'll find the tree quite navigable. Secondly, I'd maybe advise against playing a melee character as your first character, at least for the early access build, unless anything changes soon. So I guess that'll be a nice segue into my first build, a warrior with a Titan ascendancy. So I was in the game day one, hour one essentially, with a 4 millisecond ping that I have never experienced since moving to New Zealand. And when I say I struggled against the very first boss, yeah. So a couple of things about the warrior. He's big and he's very slow. You will not find yourself evading attacks beyond a regular dodge roll unless for some reason you put some dexterity into your build. But when I say slow, I mean you have a negative movement speed. Yeah. This wouldn't be that big a problem, gear can remedy this, but that's assuming that you get some boots with a movement speed modifier on them, either by crafting with orbs, but more than likely if they're being sold in a shop or dropped by a felled enemy, because it's not very often that you roll a movement speed modifier. So what I did first with this guy was just sink a bunch of points into life regeneration passives, and right away I got pretty choosy about my gear. Additional strength and max health boosts were a must. Extra points if it had life regeneration. And for all classes, I'd fully recommend a regenerating health flask and mana flask if you can swing it. And for gear, I decided to go for a one-handed mace and shield. Some defenses, any really would be great. You're probably asking if I went for the Giant's Blood Keystone, and no, I didn't. Don't ask me why I didn't, I just didn't. Probably should've, because it may have assisted with the problem I inevitably found myself running into. Having to kill bosses by attrition, 1,000 cuts, rather than by big killing blow. I'd have to massively overlevel in order to kill certain bosses if they were optional. I'd say around level 50 was when I finally found some equilibrium with my build. I'd finally felt my life stack was strong enough to put more points and care into skills and melee passives. But I basically had a couple friends carry me through the ends of Act 2 and a little of Act 3, so take that with a grain of salt. My first ascendancy, I think I got around level 50-ish, but I had massively overleveled in order to ensure that I would get through the first one. I did the Trial of Chaos alone, and it took a couple tries, as I had rolled some awful bird boss that had these tornadoes that would just insta-kill you. Third try was the charm. I rolled the Chimera boss, and after a very long and exhausting battle, I got my first ascendancy. C was Trial of the Sekimas, I believe before the 0.1.0 E-patch, and I can't lie, I hated it so much. I was massively overleveled for that as well, and it still nearly killed me. It's incredibly tedious, and you have to hope you don't get hit. Hard to do as a warrior trying to run away from fire. I was also not great at using my shield, and that was frankly just my bad. So once I got to endgame, I started off fairly strong, but I made a pretty crucial error. I forgot to juice my waystones. This is basically the main way that you get your waystones back, so if you don't juice your waystones to either magic or rare, you're likely not getting one back. The further up the tiers I got, the more I started to die again, so I stopped juicing waystones, which made it next to impossible to progress. I didn't even get to level 80 with this guy, and I got to tier 8 waystones. And by the way, if you die, you lose experience towards your next level, so yeah. The going got real rough, and I finally just threw in the towel for the time being and started my next character. My current character at the time of recording is a ranger with a Pathfinder ascendancy. This experience was a lot smoother for quite a few reasons. I won't sit here and say it's not because I was now familiar with the campaign, but there's also a lot of other contributing factors. By this time, a couple of quality of life patches had come out, but more to the point, this is a character that's faster, is evasive, meaning there's less of a chance for her to get hit, and can have some distance between her and enemies, which is also something that prevents her from getting hit as often. There's also the point of having gear in my stash that I'd gathered with my warrior that I could then give to my ranger. Not everything, but as I leveled, there were flasks, charms, rings, belts, and amulets that I could reuse. I will say, as a side note, be sure to save those types of items at lower levels as well as higher ones. I made the mistake early on of selling off my early leveling gear for my warrior build as I was no longer using it. I also didn't have that many stash tabs to be fair, but if you plan on hanging in Standard League, I can recommend keeping what you can. This isn't to say that I didn't still have trouble. Rangers can't face tank hits the way warriors can, and throughout most of my build I haven't had much life regen. Still don't, really. I also have had a lot more trouble with capping resistances, especially as I've reached endgame. This can really only be resolved by doing some massive respec or trading for better gear, and I really haven't had much luck on crafting. But I've been trying to avoid trading. Don't ask me why, it's just kind of a personal hang-up I have. I get annoyed enough at myself when I have to rely on what's in our guild stash to get better gear. I imagine as time goes on, I'll find myself trading anyways, but I also just don't have a good feel for the economy yet, as that's a mechanic that's mostly foreign to me in terms of gaming. That just boils down to a lack of education on my part, and I fully take responsibility for that. Anyways, this character I've played mostly by myself. I've really only had to get help for Wrathbreaker and Act 2 Cruel. Not regular Act 2, but Cruel I just couldn't get past him for some reason. I also had help getting my third ascendancy, and it feels unlikely I'll try for a fourth with this one. Which is fine, I am at best a middlingly average player, and I fully understand the need for certain things like that to be more or less gate-kept. This character also did require a lot more respecking in order to get a good feel. DPS is really vital with a ranger build, and as I was going for a poison build, I beelined for notables that would allow my poisons to stack and do even more damage. I also kept in a couple of skills that were more physical damage based, as every so often there are monsters that are chaos resistant and therefore I would need to take a different approach. I hope by the time I start a new character, I'll be able to be even more self-reliant. It feels incredibly rewarding to find good loot and do things on your own. This game has forced me to really assess how I play games, what I enjoy out of them, and what gives me that dopamine hit. I wrote a piece for Reload magazine that talks about why players play hard games, even when the failure that you can feel when trying to kill a hard boss and losing can be crushing. I didn't fully get it then, but I get it now. It's like hitting your personal best on a bench press, or finishing a marathon, or solving a really hard maths problem, which, to be honest, Path of Exile 2 is really just one big maths problem. The stats all matter, and how they interact with each other can create some really insane results. I fully admire the people who can create build guides, because the way that Zizaran basically made a witch out of a ranger character is just bonkers to me. You can really get creative with builds, and I am excited to eventually try some new things with cross-class builds and get outside the box. I will say, I refuse to use the meta builds, because honestly, what's the point of a one-button boss nuke? While it's fun to be able to clear screens and screens of enemies with a little effort, I currently just can't get behind the philosophy of just being able to nuke everything in one go. I imagine maybe when I'm another 1,000 hours into this game, I may feel differently, but for now, I'll take my builds that are still a little trash. Because in my opinion, if you're new, this game is about the journey and not the destination. So, if you're on the fence about trying Path of Exile 2 because you think it may not be your thing, I hope this video informed you a little bit more about the game from a new player's perspective. I may end up posting more PoE2 content as well as time goes on. You can see my reaction to the 0.1.1 patch preview, or if you want to see my other videos, have a cruise around the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.